"Stand aside, beggar," my brother snapped loud enough for the entire restaurant to turn and stare, just as the waiter reached for the card, already in my hand. And for one absurd moment, I wondered if the sound of porcelain forks clinking against cheap glass plates had briefly stopped because of me, because of that word, that sharp, humiliating word floating in the warm air of the family-style place my mother loved so much for her 60th birthday, as if it were a celebration of everything she thought we still were, even when none of it had been true for years. Derek did not just take the check. He yanked it so hard the receipt printer nearly toppled. He grabbed my card and held it up like evidence of a crime, shaking his head with a theatrical sigh, as if the entire room needed him to narrate the downfall of the most pitiful sibling ever produced by a family in Tacoma. "Beggar," he repeated slower, clearer, savoring it almost, and a woman at the far end of the room winced while another gave me a long, pitying look. The kind older women in their 50s give when they think you are trapped in a toxic family you cannot escape. I kept my smile small, polite, my lips barely moving, so the muscles in my jaw would not betray how deep the stab had gone. Because if there is one truth every woman over 30 learns, it is this: humiliation hurts twice when it comes from blood. Linda. My mother let out a weak laugh, the kind meant to smooth over conflict even when her voice trembled with unease, and she patted my arm, saying, "He is joking, sweetheart. Do not take everything so personally. You have always been the sensitive one anyway." Derek snorted, ready for his next jab, eager to showcase his imagined superiority to anyone within earshot. Telling the table she lives on, scholarship, leftovers, and coupon apps, she piggybacks on building Wi-Fi. She is basically a modern beggar. A few cousins chuckled, someone murmured, "At least Derek has a stable life. At least he has a house and a real job." And I kept my eyes softened as if the words were weightless, even though my watch buzzed at that exact moment with a notification that would have silenced the entire room if anyone else had seen it. Board approval, Sentinel AI integration, signed wire, 18 million installment processed. I tapped my wrist quickly, letting the screen go dark before anyone could glimpse the truth. Another vibration arrived, an email marked urgent from a global bank, where I served quietly as an advisor. They had reduced millions in fraud losses using a method I designed one evening in a tiny Seattle apartment with a used laptop and a cup of instant noodles. But I closed that notification too, letting it disappear under the shadow of my discount tote bag, a deliberate disguise that helped me remain invisible to the people who believed they knew me best. Then, as if humiliating me were a team sport, my aunt leaned forward, smiling that patronizing smile people reserve for the underachieving niece, and said, "If Derek had not driven you to Seattle in his old van to look at the university, you never would have made it." Derek puffed up immediately. Finally, someone remembered his revisionist history, and he said, "I let her borrow my credit for years. I covered things for her that no one knows about. I carried her through school." The twist that knifed through me was old but still sharp, because I knew the truth I had carried him. He had drowned my credit once and left me to fix the mess alone. But here he was, posing as the savior. When the waiter returned, asking one check or separate, Derek almost shouted, "One check. Put it on me. She cannot even afford water." That was when the spark of my first micro-revenge lit itself almost without thought. I smiled warmly at the waiter and handed him my loyalty card, pretending it was the only thing I had meant to give him, and he nodded enthusiastically before taking Derek's payment. When he returned, I discreetly opened the tipping app linked to my private account and doubled the amount Derek had left. The waiter caught my eye and thanked me in a soft, appreciative tone, the kind reserved for regulars or owners. And although Derek did not notice the subtle shift in respect, the surrounding staff absolutely did, and the audience would too. After dessert, I leaned toward my mother and whispered, "Tomorrow, I want you to come to Seattle with me. I want you to see where I am building my life." Derek scoffed loudly, unable to resist another blow. A cramped student room in some rundown building sent the location. "I will come for a laugh. Maybe I will show you what a real house looks like." I met his smirk with a calm, steady voice. "Not a house, Derek, something a little higher than that, a little more sky. The next morning, the three of us stood inside the glass lobby of a tower in downtown Seattle sunlight, scattering across the marble floors as Derek muttered just loud enough for a cluster of people to hear smells like other people's. Money in here. Careful not to touch anything too expensive, Beggar. Before I could respond, a tall man approached, scanning his tablet until his eyes caught my name and everything changed. His face pulled into an expression of clear recognition, and he said, "Miss Aria Winter, we are ready for your 50 million Sky Penthouse walkthrough." Derek froze. The room shifted. My story was only beginning. Before I tell you how a so-called beggar walked into the Sky Penthouse she actually owned, if you have ever been torn down by your own family, leave a comment, because this is not just a revenge story. Money, this is quiet justice, silent revenge, and the moment you begin standing up for yourself. Tacoma in 2010 felt like a place that had stopped growing long before any of us were born. The kind of working-class neighborhood where engines hummed late into the night, and the smell of grease floated through cracked windows. And inside our small, worn house on Alder Street, the rules of the Winter family were written as firmly as if they had been carved into the kitchen table rules that always favored one person and never me. Frank Winter. My father ruled the house with the blunt certainty of a man who believed his value came from the weight of his voice and the cash in his wallet, and he carried both like weapons pacing through the cramped living room in his stained work boots, telling anyone who would listen that men built the world while women tagged along beside it, and he said it often enough that even the faded wallpaper seemed to repeat the message. My mother, Linda, moved like a quiet shadow around him, gentle, patient, always tired, as if every apology she whispered for him chipped away at her a little more. She clung to stability the way some people cling to religion, and she convinced herself that keeping peace was the same as keeping love, even when that peace required burying herself under Frank's temper. Then there was Derek, the golden child, the son who could do no wrong, the future head of the household. A title Frank used without irony, even though Derek at 19 barely woke up before noon and spent most evenings bragging about his non-existent plans for greatness, and still everyone smiled at him as though he had already earned medals for breathing. And then there was me at 14, a girl who loved numbers more than noise, who found comfort in logic when people felt too unpredictable, who stayed up late with a secondhand laptop, whose fan rattled like it was dying, who learned lines of code from YouTube videos, whispered through cheap earbuds. I was the only one in the house dreaming beyond Tacoma, yet no one seemed to notice that I carried ambitions larger than our entire kitchen. The first time I overheard Frank talking about the college fund, the words carved themselves into my chest so quietly and cleanly that I did not even bleed. He told Derek that real opportunity belonged to men, then added without hesitation that girls did not need college, since they eventually married into someone else's money. And when I stood frozen in the hallway hearing my own future dismissed like a silly thought, I realized how early injustice can take root. Linda found me later that evening sitting at the tiny dining table with my homework spread across the scarred wood. She touched my shoulder gently and whispered that she would save something for me, even if Frank would never approve a soft, fragile promise, spoken like a secret. And I wanted to believe her because she was the only person in that house who at least tried to see me. Nights in our kitchen were cold even in summer, and I would sit hunched over the old laptop Frank bought from a coworker for $20 typing, slowly learning how to make shapes, move across the screen, how to build tiny logic puzzles, how to understand the quiet power behind code. The dim overhead bulb flickered, but I kept going, my breath fogging a little in the air as if the house itself disapproved of anything ambitious happening inside it. When I won a small programming award at school, a certificate and $200, I brought it home with a shy, hopeful pride, imagining for one foolish moment that Frank or Derek might see me differently. But Derek only laughed, calling it a game and asking if I had figured out how to make real money yet. And Frank took most of the cash without asking, saying he needed to cover bills. then tossed the rest to Derek for gas money, and I found myself holding an empty envelope, wondering how success could turn invisible so quickly. That was also the first time Frank drunkenly threw the word leech at me during one of his late-night rants, declaring that the entire house survived because of him, that girls only spent money never made it, and that tapping away on a keyboard did not count as real work, and even though I knew he was wrong, the sting burrowed deep, leaving a mark I could not quite reach. Looking back, that was the seed of injustice, the moment when I understood that in our family, value was a sign not earned, that Derek could fail upward forever, while I could succeed quietly and still be overlooked, and that realization settled inside me like a stone. But even stones can become stepping points, and one night, while washing dishes and listening to an old radio in the background, I heard a segment about young founders in Seattle. People barely older than Derek creating software that banks depended on, and I leaned closer, listening to every word as if someone had opened a door I never knew existed. And by the time the show ended, a new thought had taken root inside me, a thought that whispered, if I became good enough, no one in this house would be able to diminish me again. The next week, Linda opened a tiny savings account she called Aria's Little Future Fund, smiling softly as if she was gifting me independence itself. But the account was in her name, and Frank's name, not mine. And I did not yet understand what that meant for my future, or how easily that money would slip through my fingers. I only knew that I wanted to believe her when she said she was trying. The truth is that the injustice did not come all at once. It came in small comments and quiet dismissals and missing dollars and stolen opportunities, layering slowly until it became a truth too heavy for any girl to ignore. And as I watched Derek drive off in a used car Frank bought for him, while I walked to school carrying a backpack patched with tape, I felt something inside me shift, a vow forming without ceremony, or witness a promise that if I ever wanted to escape this shrinking world, I would have to climb my way out on my own. And so the seed was planted long before I knew what it would grow into, a seed watered by unfairness and strengthened by silence and shaped by every person who said I was meant for less, a seed that would one day fuel everything that came after. By 2014, I was 18, and for the first time in my life, I felt like the world might actually open for me when I received the email from the University of Washington, congratulating me for winning a partial scholarship that covered half my tuition, and I stood in my tiny dorm-style room in Tacoma with my acceptance letter in my hands, trembling just a little, because despite everything I had grown up hearing about my supposed limits, I had done something no one in my family expected, and that alone filled me with a quiet, hopeful excitement, a warmth I carried with me the entire bus ride home as I rehearsed how I would tell them, imagining for just a moment that maybe they would look at me with pride instead of annoyance. When I walked into the house, Frank was sitting in his usual chair, beer in hand, Derek lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone, and Linda was at the sink, washing dishes, even though the plate pile was barely a handful, and I took a deep breath and said, I got in. I got the scholarship, waiting for a smile or at least acknowledgement, but the room barely shifted as if my words were too light to matter, until Frank finally looked up with that unimpressed stare and said, Con Guy Kong Can Hok Sa, then switched back to English with a shrug, telling me there was work in Tacoma and I should help the family instead of running off to Seattle like I thought I was special. And for a moment, the hope inside me flickered. I said I needed a little extra money for books and housing since the scholarship only covered tuition, and I gently reminded them about the small college fund Linda had whispered to me about years earlier, the one that had kept me believing that at least someone was rooting for my future, and Linda froze, hands still submerged in the soapy water, looking guilty, while Frank's expression hardened into something I instantly recognized as danger. And before she could speak, he said flatly, There is no fun, not anymore. And Derek stretched his arms with a satisfied sigh, like he had been waiting for this moment. When I asked what happened, Linda tried to step in, but Frank cut in louder, explaining as if it were obvious that Derek had gotten into an accident a few months back, and the car repairs were expensive, and he had debts on his credit card because he was trying to launch himself like a real man, and Frank said every family uses money where it is needed most. And right then I realized the fund meant for my education had been drained to rescue Derek without a single word to me, and my father looked at me with disbelief that I was even questioning it, while saying, Derek kon tuong lai kon thi kong, kan nihyo, as if a daughter's ambition was a luxury item not worth spending on. I felt the humiliation like a physical punch, not because of the money, but because of how casually my future had been sacrificed for my brother's mistakes, and that humiliation deepened a few days later, during the family barbecue, when relatives filled the backyard and I tried to share the news of my scholarship, hoping maybe among extended families someone would care. But when my aunt asked how I planned to pay the rest, Frank laughed a loud, mocking laugh that carried across the tables, saying, she thinks few grades make her. Someone money doesn't grow on trees. And Derek added with that smirk, I hated saying she is like a beggar of knowledge, always stealing Wi-Fi from neighbors for those little coding games, and everyone chuckled the way people do when the joke isn't funny. But cruelty is a form of entertainment, and I stood there holding a paper plate of potato salad, feeling small, invisible, humiliated in a way that stung deeper than anything before, because it wasn't just strangers diminishing me, it was my own blood. For the first time I pushed back, I said that money was promised to me, that it was not theirs to use, and Frank stood up, slamming his palm on the picnic table, telling me that every dollar was his because he earned it, and that I needed to stop acting entitled when I hadn't contributed anything yet. And Linda stepped in, crying, begging me not to make everything worse, insisting that Derek would pay it back someday, which was a lie we all silently understood. And in that moment, something cold settled into me, a truth I had tried to ignore, finally taking shape, that my place in this family was predetermined and it was never going to be equal. That night in my room, I calculated how much I needed to move to Seattle and realized I would have to borrow, so I researched student loans until 2 a.m, reading everything I could about repayment, interest, credit scores, terms. I barely understood but knew I needed to master because the people who should have helped me simply would not. And on the night before my departure, while I packed my 2 cheap suitcases, I overheard Derek on the phone, laughing to a friend saying, "The little one will crawl back within a semester. Seattle will chew her up. Her brain is not enough for real competition," and I stood frozen in the hallway, realizing that he truly believed I had no value beyond what I could sacrifice for him. The next morning, I boarded the bus to Seattle carrying $700 in my account and a determination that felt sharper than pain. And as the city faded from view, I told myself a truth I would not fully understand until years later, that if I ever managed to succeed, it would be mine alone, and no one who had taken from me would ever touch the life I built again. Moving to Seattle felt like stepping into another universe, one where no one knew my family, where no one measured my worth by how little they expected from me, where every street and every crowded bus and every late-night shift at the campus cafe felt like a small victory because I was finally living a life that belonged only to me. And even though money was tight, the air felt lighter than anything I had breathed in Tacoma. And I carried that freedom with me each morning when I woke up in the cramped apartment I shared with 3 other students, the walls thin enough for me to hear someone brushing their teeth, 2 rooms away and the floors creaking whenever anyone moved after midnight. Yet I did not resent any of it because it was mine, my own first taste of independence. I worked as a barista before class, steaming milk at 6 a.m. while the sky was still the color of steel, and customers mumbled their orders through half-closed eyes. Then after lectures, I graded assignments as a teaching assistant, and once the campus quieted, I stayed up late, coding small freelance projects that paid far less than they should, but let me keep learning and growing. And although my diet consisted mostly of instant noodles and dollar store vegetables, I felt a steady hum of pride in my chest each time I paid my portion of rent or bought used textbooks with money I earned myself. That life might have been exhausting, but it was honest and it was peaceful in a way I had never known, because for the first time, no one could barge into my room drunk or shout across the hall about how useless I was, and no one dismissed my goals as childish dreams. In my sophomore year, I applied for an internship at a tiny startup working on fraud detection technology, and I got it mostly because I had unknowingly solved a tricky logic puzzle in their interview that others had struggled with. And that was the first day I met Raina Brooks, a 50-something black woman with calm eyes and the kind of presence that filled a room without raising her voice, the sort of person who could make engineers twice her size sit straighter, simply by asking a question in that measured, thoughtful way of hers. Raina watched me code one afternoon, studying the way I examined the data, not just for patterns, but for the behavior behind the patterns. And she said quietly, "You do not just see numbers, you see people." And I remember staring at her confused because no one had ever described my mind in a way that felt like a compliment instead of a warning. And from that moment, she became the closest thing I had to a mentor. Yet even as I grew into my work and discovered parts of myself I had long hidden, the calls from home never changed, and they always came with a familiar rhythm, a brief greeting, then a request for money wrapped in guilt and obligation. Linda, calling with tears in her voice, saying, "Your father's back is killing him, and Derek is working long hours, so could you send $200 just this month, please?" And even though I had barely enough for groceries, I sent it because she sounded so tired, and because old habits die slow. Not once did she ask if I was eating well, or if I was okay, or if I needed help. The calls were always about their emergencies, never mine. And after hanging up each time, I sat on my thin mattress staring at the ceiling, wondering how a family could feel so far away even when they remembered my number, only when bills were due. When I visited Tacoma one weekend, hoping maybe things had softened a little, I found myself slipping back into that old familiar silence. As Frank stood in the driveway chatting with the neighbors, saying, "My daughter works at a coffee shop now, at least she is not leeching off us anymore," and Derek laughed beside him, saying, "Harvard, Quay, no law, Starbucks, Joe," making sure the neighbors heard every humiliating word as if my jobs were a joke, rather than the work that kept me afloat. Inside the house, I tried telling them about a project I had helped with a tool that detected suspicious transactions in milliseconds, something the startup was excited about, something Raina had praised me for, but when I said it out loud, Derek wrinkled his nose, saying it sounded like a pile of buzzwords you memorized to sound smart. Real money is not made by sitting at a computer guessing things. And Frank nodded along as though Derek were the authority on anything other than excuses. And I realized, swiftly, painfully, that I could win a Nobel Prize, and they would still call it luck. Back in Seattle after that visit, I found myself confiding in Raina about the strain, about the never-ending judgment, and the way their opinions still lingered in my chest like a bruise that refused to fade. And she listened with a patience I had rarely experienced before she tapped her pen against her notepad, then said in her soft, steady tone, "You do not owe them your success. Their approval is not a requirement for you to rise. They are not the audience you are performing for and hearing." That felt like a door opening, a small moment of clarity that would shape decisions I had not yet realized I would need to make. It was around that time that I began jotting ideas into a small notebook, a habit I formed quietly in the corner of the startup office during lunch breaks, writing lines of thought about machine learning models, behavioral markers, fraud patterns, and ways to scale detection across international banks, the first seeds of something I called Sentinel AI, though I did not yet know how far it would eventually take me, only that I felt a pull toward it. A sense that if I could build something real, something powerful enough, I could rewrite the story of my life without asking for anyone's permission. That notebook became the one place where no voice tried to drown mine out, where the dreams I wrote felt possible, where every sketch of an algorithm, every scribbled diagram, every half-formed idea reminded me that I was more than the girl they once called a beggar of knowledge, and that Seattle had given me the chance to grow into someone they had never believed I could be. By 2018, I had finally begun to feel the ground beneath my feet steady a little as my internship shifted into a part-time role and my notebook of ideas for Sentinel AI grew thicker each month. Yet the more I built my own life, the more my family seemed determined to pull pieces of it back into their orbit, and it started with a call from Derek one gray morning when I was walking to the office with a cup of cheap coffee cooling too fast in the Seattle air. His voice sounding unusually soft as he said he needed my help, and that since I was the one in college, I probably understood banking better than he did. And before I could answer, he launched into a story about how he was planning to buy a used van to start a small delivery business. But the bank wanted a second signature, someone trustworthy, someone with a future. The implication hanging heavy in the pauses as if he were daring me to refuse. He said it would be just a small signature, nothing binding, nothing risky, simply a formality, and I felt the old familiarity of manipulation curling through the line, especially when Linda took the phone from him, her voice trembling with rehearsed worry as she whispered, "If you do not sign, your brother might lose his chance, and he has already sacrificed so much for this family. Please help him," aria words that pricked at my ribs because they were designed to reach the version of me that still wanted to be a good daughter, a good sister, someone who still believed that kindness would eventually return to her. I agreed reluctantly, telling them I would meet them at the bank that weekend. And when I arrived, Derek was already pacing outside, wearing a smile too wide to be sincere. And he handed me the papers quickly, flipping to the signature page with the smooth confidence of someone who had done this dance before. And when I tried to read the details, the loan officer began rushing us, saying they had another appointment soon, so I should just sign. Where Derek pointed, and he covered the section that listed the actual interest rate, with his hand pretending to straighten the pages, while Linda kept repeating that everything was fine, that it was only temporary, that family supports family. I signed because I was young, because I was tired, because I still believed that helping them might one day mean they would help me. And in the moment, it felt like an unavoidable obligation rather than a choice. 3 months later, an envelope arrived in my mailbox with the heavy seriousness of bad news inside a notice from the bank informing me that the loan I had co-signed was past due, and that my credit score had dropped after multiple missed payments, and I stood in my tiny apartment holding the letter with my heartbeat thudding against my palms as the reality sank in, that Derek had not paid a single installment, and because of that, my financial foundation was now shaking again, just as I had begun to feel secure. When I called him demanding an explanation, he sighed as if I were bothering him and said calmly, "You are the one with a degree. You can figure it out. I cannot. So you just handle it for now." The casual entitlement in his voice slicing deeper than any insult because it revealed exactly how he viewed me. Not as a sister, not as a person, but as a financial cushion. He felt entitled to land on whenever he stumbled. That call broke something inside me, but the shattering was not done, because a few weeks later, sitting in my apartment staring at my dwindling checking balance, I asked Linda the question I should have asked years earlier. What happened to the money you saved for me? The little future fund you promised, and silence spread across the line before she answered in a small, shaky voice that the account had been emptied long ago to help Derek get back on his feet after yet another debt. Another crisis, another justification that always ended with the same conclusion that he was the son and I was the one expected to understand. She tried to soften the blow, saying, "Once Derek is stable, he will help you later. You know he loves you." But the words did not soothe, they burned because I finally understood the truth. I had tiptoed around for years that I was not the daughter they supported. I was the emergency wallet they opened whenever Derek lacked responsibility, and the realization left me breathless as if the air around me had thinned to nothing. In that moment, a cold clarity settled over me, a clarity born not from anger, but from exhaustion. the kind that comes when you finally stop explaining your hurt to people who benefit from ignoring it. And I knew I needed to draw a line even if no one else would see it. That night, with my laptop open and my notebook beside me, I wrote a list in small, steady handwriting, the kind of list people make when they have finally run out of illusions. And at the top, I wrote no more co-signing right underneath it. I wrote no more just this once. And at the bottom, I added, protect your credit, protect your future. And the simple act of writing those lines felt like reclaiming a part of myself I had lost to years of guilt and obligation. The next morning, while everyone in the apartment slept, I woke early and walked to a quiet cafe where I spent hours reviewing every email, every loan document, every financial record, tying together the threads of how easily I had been used. And as painful as the realization was, it fueled something fierce in me, a determination to build a life so strong that their hands could never reach it again. Around this time, Raina called me into her office, a small glass-walled space filled with whiteboards covered in scribbles of fraud patterns and code, and she closed her laptop with a thoughtful look, saying the company wanted to bring me on full-time, offering a small share of equity if the product scaled the way they expected, and I felt my breath catch. Because this was the first real door someone had ever opened for me willingly, without strings, without guilt, without expectations that I would sacrifice myself in return. I accepted the offer, but as I walked home with the Seattle wind whipping against my jacket, a new thought took root inside me. A thought that surprised me with its boldness, that if I could create value for someone else's company, I could certainly build something of my own, something bigger, something stronger, something they would never see coming. And with that thought, I understood that my real revenge would never be loud or dramatic. It would be the quiet, patient building of a life that was undeniably mine. Leaving Raina's company felt both terrifying and inevitable. And when I told her one quiet afternoon in late 2019 that I wanted to try building Sentinel AI on my own, she did not react with disappointment the way I had feared. Instead, she leaned back in her chair with that slow, thoughtful expression she always wore when she was weighing possibilities, and she said, "If you fall, make sure you fall forward toward me, because my door will always open for you." And those words settled deep inside me, like a blessing I did not know how much I would need. I packed my things from the small shared office, hugged her once, with the awkward affection of people who are both strong and guarded, then stepped into the foggy Seattle air with my laptop bag feeling heavier than usual, as if it understood the responsibility I was about to place on it. With the little savings I had, I rented a cramped room the size of a walk-in closet above a noisy convenience store, the kind of room where the heater rattled at night and the window frame whistled whenever the wind pushed against it, and I returned to the familiar diet of instant noodles and canned soup, choosing to invest every spare dollar into server costs and data tools rather than comfort. The first year blurred into an exhausting loop of late nights and early mornings, with me sitting at a tiny desk, typing lines of code until my eyes burned, then testing them on small batches of data, only to watch the models fail again and again. I pitched Sentinel AI to small regional banks that barely let me finish my demos before politely declining, saying they did not have the budget, or they did not trust a one-woman operation, or they already had a legacy system that worked well enough, which I knew was not true, but I lacked the reputation to convince them otherwise. I sent dozens of cold emails each week and received almost no replies, and I tried to stretch every cloud computing credit as far as I could until eventually even those ran out, and I started working late shifts at a different coffee shop just to keep the servers running. And even then there were nights when the code refused to make sense, and my head felt too heavy to stay upright, until finally one dawn I woke up with my cheek pressed to the keyboard, realizing I had fainted from sheer exhaustion. During all of this, my family continued their patterns, unchanged, as if nothing in my life was shifting. Linda called occasionally, not to ask how I was coping, but to tell me that Derek was stressed about work or needed help driving her to an appointment. And one evening, when I said gently that I could not come home because I was building a company, she responded with that weary sigh that always made me feel 11 years old again, saying, "You are still not as stable as your brother. He has a real path. You should think about settling into something dependable too." And those words carved a new hollow inside me, because even now, after everything I had worked for, they still saw me as the unstable one, as the disappointment. Then came 2020, and with it, the phone call that felt like cold metal against my skin, when Linda told me that Frank had collapsed, and a few hours later called again to say he was gone. And despite everything, despite the years of hurt, I felt my knees weaken as I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to her sobs breaking through the static of the line, grief arriving in a shape more complicated than love or anger. I took the bus back to Tacoma, arriving to a house that felt smaller than ever, with relatives filling the living room, speaking in hushed tones, and Derek standing in the center, like the heir to a throne he believed was his by birthright. And when he saw me, he nodded without warmth, then turned to his friend, saying loud enough for me to hear she probably came to watch us divide assets. She's always been desperate for money, and though no one laughed, the silence that followed felt even worse. At the small memorial service, I sat alone near the back while everyone else clustered around Derek, offering sympathy and praise for how he would handle the family affairs from now on. And when the will was read later that day, my suspicions were confirmed in the most predictable and yet painfully sharp way. Every real asset, the house, the garage, the small patch of land, went entirely to Derek, while I received a small amount of cash that was almost symbolic, and even that sum was listed as offsetting debts Derek had supposedly paid for me years earlier, a lie so transparent that my chest tightened with a mixture of humiliation and fury. And it was not about the money, it was about the message that even in death, Frank had repeated the same story he had told throughout his life, that Derek mattered, and I did not. After the reading, I walked out into the cold dusk air and ended up checking into a cheap motel near the cemetery, a place where the walls smelled faintly of bleach and loneliness, and I sat on the edge of the bed, letting everything I had carried for years finally settle on me all at once: the exhaustion, the unfairness, the constant climbing, the fear that Sentinel AI might fail before it even had a chance to prove itself. And for the first time in a long while, I felt myself unravel as tears I had swallowed for years finally came without restraint. I thought about giving up, not because I lacked ability, but because I was so weary of carrying myself alone, and the idea of taking a stable job at a mid-sized tech company seemed like an escape, a chance to rest, a chance to stop fighting every single day. And I stared at the ceiling of that dim motel room, wondering if this was the end of the dream I had worked so hard to build. Then my phone buzzed with an email notification, and when I opened it, the subject line simply read, "Thought of you." The sender was Raina, and inside the message she wrote a small, straightforward paragraph explaining that a mid-level bank was experiencing severe fraud issues and needed help fast, and that she had told them about me, and suggested they consider testing out whatever I had built, and she ended with a quiet line that made my breath catch. She wrote, "I still believe in you even on the days you do not." I wiped my face with the sleeve of my jacket, breathed slowly until my hand steadied, then opened my laptop on the creaky motel desk, the screen glowing against the dark room like a lifeline, pulling me upward again. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something stir inside me. Not confidence exactly, but defiance, a refusal to let them write my ending for me. And if you have ever been told you are not worthy of a single piece of inheritance or a single ounce of belief, leave one heart so you can walk with me into what comes next. When I sent the demo to the mid-sized bank Raina mentioned, I expected nothing more than a polite rejection, because that had become the rhythm of my life. But instead, a director scheduled a call, asking if I could integrate Sentinel AI into a small portion of their transaction flow for a 90-day pilot. And I agreed with a mix of hope and fear, spending days refining my models and nights testing edge cases, until the numbers finally behaved the way I knew they could. And when the first month ended with a noticeable reduction in fraudulent chargebacks, I sat in my apartment staring at the dashboard, hardly believing what I was seeing. Then 3 months later, when the bank confirmed that their fraud losses had dropped 40% because of my system, I felt a quiet electricity moving through me, the kind that said, "This is real. This is yours. You built this with your mind and your exhaustion and your refusal to quit." That single case study became the door that once seemed permanently locked. And as I updated my website and sent new emails, something shifted because suddenly calls began coming in from other banks, the kinds that had ignored me before: small credit unions, mid-sized institutions, digital-only lenders, all wanting to test Sentinel AI because for the first time I had proof, and proof changes everything. So within a year, I found myself running a 12-person team, a mix of engineers and data scientists and analysts, squeezed into a rented startup office, decorated with whiteboards filled with my early scribbles. And each time I walked in and saw other people working on an idea that had once lived only in my notebook, I felt a soft swell of pride, like a quiet tide rising in my chest. I hired carefully, and I worked constantly, holding meetings during the day, building models at night, refining the infrastructure on weekends. And though the pressure felt enormous, it was different from the suffocating pressure of my childhood, because this pressure came with autonomy, with purpose, with the knowledge that every long night brought me closer to a world my family never imagined I could enter. Meanwhile, back in Tacoma, nothing had changed in their eyes. Linda still asked me in the same soft, tired tone when I planned to settle down and get married, because stability came from a husband, not from a company. And Derek proudly updated Facebook about the new truck he bought and how he was looking at houses in the suburbs. And whenever we spoke, he still delivered that familiar condescension, asking if my little tech thing was still hanging on, as if it were a fragile hobby I would soon abandon, and I let them believe whatever they wished because I no longer needed their approval or their understanding. Then in late 2022, the email arrived from a major fintech corporation headquartered in San Francisco, a company whose products were used nationwide and whose influence reached across financial sectors. And they wanted to discuss a potential acquisition of Sentinel AI. And for a moment, I simply stared at the screen, feeling the weight of every insult, every dismissal, every humiliation that had once convinced me I would never matter. I called Raina immediately, and she flew up to Seattle 2 days later, sitting with me in the conference room of the law firm, guiding me through negotiation strategies, making sure I understood every clause, every percentage, every structure of payout. And when I admitted quietly that part of me felt undeserving, she looked at me with a firmness that made my throat tighten, saying, "You earned this through brilliance, not luck. Do not shrink now." The acquisition offer came in at $280 million, a number so large that even saying it felt surreal and yet also strangely correct, because I knew what it cost me to build this thing with no safety net, no cheering section, no one to catch me when I fell. And as we finalized the terms, I found myself remembering the day Derek said Seattle would chew me up, remembering Frank's drunken muttering that I would never amount to anything, remembering every empty apology Linda offered instead of protection, and all of those memories made me sit a little straighter as I signed, because their disbelief had become the fuel I needed more than anything else. After the signatures were complete, I sat alone in the glass room overlooking a rainy Seattle skyline, listening to the soft patter of droplets on the window, and realizing quietly that I was no longer the girl eating noodles in a drafty room, nor the daughter waiting for scraps of affection, but someone who had built something powerful enough that an entire industry was now shifting to make room for it. And in that moment, instead of calling my family to share the news, I simply closed my laptop and walked out into the hallway, deciding that this victory belonged to me and no one else. With the acquisition funds secured and the advisory role settled, I finally allowed myself to think about where I wanted to live, the kind of space that would feel like a declaration of who I had become, and I began touring penthouses across downtown Seattle, stepping into rooms wrapped in glass overlooking Elliott Bay, walking across marble floors in spaces so quiet I could hear my own breath. And for the first time, I let myself indulge in the idea that I deserved beauty, comfort, peace, not because I needed to prove anything to Derek or Frank or anyone else, but because I had climbed far enough to choose a life that did not echo with their voices. And then I founded a sky penthouse, still under construction on the top floors of a sleek new tower, the kind of place with a private elevator, a rooftop garden, a view that stretched across the water and over the mountains where the sunsets painted the city in molten gold, and I knew instantly that this was the place where the next chapter of my life would begin. When I met Marcus the Realtor, he greeted me with a professional smile that shifted into a flicker of surprise after reviewing my financial documents, and he said softly, "Not many people your age purchase something like this, but there is no question about your approval. Everything is immaculate," and hearing that felt like a silent triumph, like a warm private applause meant only for me. The quiet revenge began forming, not as anger, but as a kind of steady clarity, a recognition that I no longer needed to shout or defend or justify anything, because the truth of who I had become would reveal itself in ways louder than any argument. And I promised myself that when the moment came when my family finally saw the life I had built, I would not need to explain a single thing. I signed the purchase agreement for the penthouse in the summer of 2023, the construction still months away from completion, and Marcus scheduled the final walkthrough and closing for October 2024, a date that seemed far away, yet marked itself in my mind with a quiet pulse, because I knew, without knowing exactly how, that the day would bring something full circle, something inevitable, something that had been growing inside me since the first time they called me worthless. The moment Derek hissed, "Stand aside, Beggar," in that crowded restaurant had already carved itself into my memory like a bruise that never fully faded. So when October arrived and the day of the walkthrough came, I felt that line hover in the back of my mind as I stepped into the lobby of the tower, with him walking a few steps ahead of me, still talking as if he understood this world, and Linda trailing behind trying to smooth the tension, the way she always had. But the real turning point began the instant Marcus looked up from his tablet and saw me. His expression shifted from polite professionalism to a flicker of recognition and surprise as he said, "Miss Winter, I was not expecting you to bring guests today." And Derek seized the comment instantly with that smug familiarity he always used when he thought someone was beneath him, saying, "She is my sister. She is just staying in some temporary place right now, nothing fancy." And he laughed lightly as if the idea of me owning anything substantial were ridiculous. Marcus did not respond to him. He simply turned to me as if waiting for my signal, and I nodded toward the private elevator tucked behind the marble column, the one with the small silver panel that required an access card rather than a button, and Marcus gestured for me to go ahead, saying, "Whenever you are ready." Miss Winter prompting Derek to scoff under his breath as he muttered something about showy amenities designed to impress gullible buyers. When I pulled the slim white card from my bag and tapped it against the reader, the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Derek stepped inside with the careless arrogance of someone convinced he understood the world he was entering. But his smirk faltered slightly when he noticed the panel containing only 2 buttons, one labeled Lobby and the other Sky Penthouse, because the absence of floors between them suddenly made the illusion of scale impossible to ignore. As the elevator rose smoothly, the city unfolding beneath our feet through the glass walls, Derek tried to regain control of the conversation by asking if I was here shadowing a client or if I was tagging along for a personal viewing, like a fan trying on a lifestyle that was not hers, and I simply said nothing, letting the quiet settle around us, because for once, silence belonged to me, not him. When the elevator finally slowed and the soft light spilled in through the opening doors, Derek stepped forward expecting a hallway, expecting more floors, expecting something that made sense in his version of reality. But instead, he froze mid-step as the doors opened directly into the entrance of the penthouse. A vast open space with floor-to-ceiling windows, where the entire city glittered beneath a wide blue sky, and the workers inside paused when they saw me, then greeted me respectfully with morning mom as they resumed adjusting chandeliers and aligning marble tiles. The shift in the room felt immediate, as if the air itself understood who belonged and who did not, and Marcus stepped ahead of us with a calm reverence in his voice, saying, "Welcome home, Miss Winter. This is the final walkthrough of your Sky penthouse valued at $50 million and fully registered under your name." And Derek's body seemed to short-circuit. For a moment, his fingers curling into his palms, his mouth parting without sound, as if the idea refused to fit inside his mind. Linda gripped the back of a nearby chair, whispering, "Aria, is this yours? Are you really the owner?" As her voice trembled between disbelief and awe. And I watched the smallness of the question echo across her face, because for years she had been taught to shrink expectation. And now the reality before her had grown too large to comprehend. A lighting specialist adjusting fixtures above us asked me if I preferred the warmer bulbs or the daylight tone, and a security manager approached with a folder containing my access credentials, asking me to confirm which family members should receive entry permissions, and the decorators paused to check color palettes with me, while Derek stood silent and deeply out of place, like someone who had stumbled onto a stage where the script no longer recognized him. He tried desperately to salvage his pride, forcing a weak laugh, asking if I had won the lottery or stumbled into something lucky, trying to reshape the narrative into one that restored his position above me. But Marcus unintentionally severed whatever illusion he was attempting to build when he said with professional clarity, "Not luck, sir. Her company, Sentinel AI, recently finalized a major acquisition. She's one of the youngest founders in Seattle to complete a deal of that magnitude, and the contractors nearby nodded as if they had known this for weeks, while Derek swallowed hard, his throat working visibly as his eyes darted between me and the sweeping views outside. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, not just physically but in presence, in confidence and certainty. And as he stood there, taking in the penthouse, a place he could never have imagined for me, I felt no need to raise my voice or prove anything, because the truth had already spoken louder than anything I could ever say. I turned to him with a calmness that felt almost weightless and said, "You called me a beggar, and you laughed while doing it. I wanted you to see how wrong you were, because sometimes the only way people like you learn is when the truth is standing taller than your pride." And he opened his mouth to respond, but no words came, not an excuse, not an apology, not even a denial, only the stunned silence of someone realizing their version of the world had been permanently rewritten. Linda wiped her eyes, looking around the space, trying to reconcile the daughter she had allowed others to belittle with the woman standing in front of her now, and the workers continued moving respectfully around us, acknowledging me at every turn, while Derek seemed to shrink further with every mom, every confirmation, every detail that reinforced the reality he had spent nearly my entire life refusing to see. The moment felt both surreal and inevitable, like reaching the summit of a climb I had begun without realizing how far the fall had pushed me. And as I stood in the center of the penthouse with the light pouring onto the polished floors, I finally understood that quiet vindication does not need applause, it only needs truth, revealed in its own time. And if you have ever wished for the day when you could stand silently while those who underestimated you finally saw who you really are, comment one day so this moment can belong to you too. Derek's silence in the penthouse did not last long, because shock for him was never a resting place. It was simply the pause before anger, and as soon as the workers drifted back to their tasks and Marcus stepped aside to answer a call, He turned toward me with a tightening jaw and a flush rising beneath his skin, saying in a strained voice that I had embarrassed him on purpose, that I had dragged him here just to make him look stupid in front of strangers, and he spoke with the same entitlement he had worn since childhood, as if humiliation were a crime only when it happened to him, but a natural joke when aimed at me. I did not bother arguing. Instead, I stepped away gently, leading Linda toward the glass doors opening onto the terrace, and she followed with small, hesitant steps, as if afraid the floor would vanish beneath her. And when we stepped outside, the entire city spread below us with the bay reflecting streaks of afternoon sunlight and ferries drifting like slow white strokes across the water, and the distant mountains layering the horizon in soft blue shadows. And Linda pressed her hand to her mouth, whispering, "This is your home," with a tremor in her voice that carried wonder and shame and something heavier that I had never heard from her before. She kept looking around as if trying to take in every detail: the glass railing, the breeze carrying the faint smell of salt, the hum of the city hundreds of feet below. And when she finally spoke again, her words came out in a broken confession, saying, "Mi jantin sai jua mi jan ben, sai nguoi," and I felt an ache inside me because I knew she meant it. And yet I also knew it came years too late, arriving only when confronted with a truth too large to deny. I told her softly that I remembered the college fund. She promised the one emptied without warning to fix Derek's mistakes, and I remembered the inheritance where I was given nothing but debts that were never mine, and how each time I was expected to understand while Derek was expected to receive, and Linda closed her eyes with a pained expression because she could not deny any of it. The history was too clear, too consistent, too familiar. While we stood there, Derek had drifted toward Marcus inside the penthouse, intercepting him with a forced, confident smile, asking casual questions about the value of the tower, about property appreciation, about investment opportunities, and even hinting whether joint ownership arrangements were possible if someone in the family wanted to help Arya manage something this large, since men usually handled big assets, and Marcus responded with his professional politeness, explaining that the purchase was made outright under a single name, Arya Winter, with no co-owner listed and no loan involved, and Derek's smile slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a frustration he could barely contain. When I walked back inside, I found him waiting with that familiar expression he wore whenever he believed he could manipulate me, using the language of responsibility and family, and he said, "If you let me put my name on some of this, I can help you manage it properly." This kind of property needs a male perspective, someone who understands risk and value. And before he could continue, I looked at him with a calmness that had taken me years to earn and said, "You already managed my college fund. You already managed my credit. You managed everything straight into the ground." And the words landed harder than I expected, because for a moment, Derek looked like he had been slapped by the truth. I told him clearly that from now on, none of my assets, none of my accounts, none of my business decisions would involve him or depend on him or be accessible to him ever again. No co-signing, no. Just this once, no emergencies disguised as accidents, no room for the financial gravity he had always pulled me into. And the more I spoke, the more he seemed to shrink under the weight of boundaries he had never believed I would enforce. Linda stepped closer, then touching my arm, saying she was sorry that she had failed to protect me, that she had been so scared of Derek's temper and Frank's expectations that she convinced herself silence was safer than standing up, and I let her lean into me for a moment because I knew her apology came from a place of real recognition. But I also knew that forgiveness did not erase the past, nor did it obligate me to repeat it. So I told her gently that I would always make sure she was safe, but I would not allow any arrangement where Derek controlled or touched anything in my name ever again. We walked them to the elevator together, and the ride down to the lobby felt heavier than the ride up, because Derek kept looking at the reflection in the mirrored walls as if searching for the version of himself that once enjoyed superiority over me. And when the doors opened, he paused, turning back with a forced smirk, saying, do not forget. No matter how big this place is, we are still family." And I looked at him, feeling no anger, only clarity as I replied, "Families do not call each other beggar and expect to remain unchanged." As they stepped out onto the marble floor, I watched Derek's shoulders stiffen and Linda glance back one last time, as if memorizing the reality she had never allowed herself to imagine for me. And when the doors closed, I felt something inside me settle into place. The kind of peace that comes not from triumph, but from choosing yourself without hesitation. About 8 months after that day in the sky, life had settled into a quiet rhythm I had never known before morning, starting with coffee by the glass wall, while the city woke up. Below me, emails from banks and tech companies asking for my input on fraud patterns, mentoring calls with young women who reminded me of the girl who once coded in a cramped Tacoma kitchen, and investor meetings where people actually listened to me, not because they loved me or needed something from me, but because they respected what I knew, and the Penthouse had become less of a symbol and more of a sanctuary. A place where my nervous system finally understood it did not have to be on alert all the time. So when my phone lit up at 11 at night with Derek's name across the screen, my first instinct was to let it ring into the dark, to let the call join the long list of times he had ignored me. But something in me wanted to hear what his voice sounded like now that the ground under his feet was not so solid. I answered on the third ring, and his tone was nothing like the mocking confidence I remembered. It was tight and jagged around the edges as he said, "We need to talk. It is urgent. I would not be calling this late if it were not serious." And there was a dryness in his voice that made me picture him pacing a small room, somewhere not the big suburban house he had once bragged about. And after a moment, I told him I would meet him in the lobby of my building in 30 minutes. Only the lobby. I was not inviting him back into the space I had fought so hard to build. When I stepped out of the private elevator, the staff at the front desk nodded to me with quiet deference. And behind the glass doors, I saw Derek already waiting just outside Shoulders, hunched in a jacket that looked like it had seen too many rushed mornings and not enough sleep. And when he came in at the guard's buzz, he looked around the lobby with its clean lines and soft light, then back at me, as if trying to decide which version of me he should speak to. Up close, he looked older than his years, eyes ringed with fatigue, an uneven beard shadowing his jaw, and the first words out of his mouth were not hello or how are you. They were, "I am in trouble. The business went bad, faster than I thought it would. The contracts dried up, the economy turned on us. The bank is breathing down my neck, the truck is about to be repossessed. The house we were supposed to close on fell through," and he talked in frantic circles about interest rates and delayed payments and partners who had pulled out his hands, moving in restless gestures while I listened without interrupting, because I recognized the pattern, the crisis monologue that always came right before a request. He finally landed where I knew he would, leaning forward, eyes desperate, saying, "The bank will still give me one more chance if I can show them a stronger application. If you could stand in as co-signer, or even put it in your name and let me pay it." They said, "With your history and your assets, it would be easy." And the word assets hung in the air between us like a reminder of how invisible mine had been when I had none. For a moment, my mind flashed back to that thin envelope in my old Seattle kitchen, the one with my name and his at the top of the loan letter, the heavy paper that had made my hands shake, the dirty dishes stacked in the sink, the cheap microwave humming in the background, while I read how my credit had been pulled down by someone else's negligence, and I remembered sitting at that chipped table with my stomach churning, trying to figure out how many more shifts I would need to take to climb out of a hole I had never dug. I looked across the lobby at Derek now and said quietly, "The last time I signed something for you, my credit was ruined for years. The last time my money was sacrificed for yours. I lost my college fund and then my inheritance. While you called me a beggar at a restaurant, I have already paid for your chances, more chances than you even realize. And I am done." He tried to smile like we were just siblings, trading jabs, saying, "Come on, that was a joke at the restaurant. You know, I did not mean it." This is serious, this is family. You are in a position to help. This loan could keep me afloat until things turn around. But the word family had lost its magic hold over me. It felt like a word people used as a shortcut to obligation, not a promise of mutual care. And I told him, so I said helping family does not mean letting them keep their hands in your pockets when they have already proven they do not know where the bottom is. When he saw that argument was not working, he shifted to the card he thought would always win. He started talking about Linda, saying Mom is not doing well. Stress is making her blood pressure worse. She needs tests and medication. What if she needs a procedure? I cannot cover everything right now. Do you want to be the reason your own mother cannot get care? And he watched me carefully as he said it, expecting guilt to flood in and drown out my resolve. But instead, I felt something clear and sharp settle into place. I told him calmly that Mom's health was not negotiable and that if he would give me the details of her doctor and the clinic, I would happily set up a dedicated account for her medical expenses, one he would not be able to touch, and I would work directly with her providers to make sure she had what she needed, but that I would not funnel money through him again, not even for her sake, because experience had taught me that money passing through Derek had a way of disappearing before it reached its supposed destination. His face twisted in anger at that, the desperation turning to insult as he snapped. So you do not trust me that much, you think I would steal from my own mother now. And I held his gaze without flinching and said, I trust behavior, not speeches. That is how I built an entire company that sees patterns people do not want to see, and your pattern has been the same since I was a teenager. There was a long moment where he seemed to understand that I meant every word, that there was no hidden flexibility waiting to be coaxed out of me, no soft center he could poke to reopen the old wound, and then he exhaled sharply and looked away, muttering, This is unbelievable. You would rather watch your brother drown than reach down a hand when you are standing in a penthouse. This is what success did to you. It turned you selfish, but the accusation did not land where he wanted, because I knew what selfishness really looked like, and it was not refusing to sign another loan. It was stripping your sister's savings, her credit, her dignity, and calling her dramatic when she objected. Over the next months, I heard about the fallout in pieces, sometimes through Linda's shaky voice on the phone, sometimes through small-town gossip that still found its way to my inbox. Derek lost the truck he had bragged about. The dream house in the suburbs never materialized. He moved into a smaller rental on the edge of town, collecting odd jobs to keep the lights on, and every so often a message would slip through where he painted himself as the victim of cruel systems and an ungrateful sister. But I did not respond because I knew this was not my storm. It was the weather he had been forecasting for himself for years. I set up the medical account for Linda just as I had promised, spoke with her doctors, arranged payments directly, and when she apologized again for not standing up for me sooner, I told her softly that I had already decided not to live the rest of my life defined by that absence, that the best thing we could do now was stop repeating the story. Sitting alone in the quiet lobby after one of those late-night meetings, watching the elevator numbers change as residents came home to their own lives, I realized I felt no triumph in Derek's downfall, only a sober understanding that karma does not always arrive like a thunderclap. Sometimes it shows up as a series of unpaid bills landing on the doorstep of someone who always expected someone else to cover the cost. And if you have ever been pressured to rescue the same people who once pushed you under, if you have ever been blamed for refusing to drown, a second time, I want you to tell me in the comments with 2 simple words that you are done repeating that pattern. Just write, no more. In the months that followed Derek's desperate late-night plea, I found myself settling into a steadier rhythm, not one defined by revenge or triumph, but by a quieter kind of clarity. The kind that grows when you finally stop asking people who cannot love you well to love you better, and much of that clarity came from the new routine I built around caring for Linda in a way that supported her without reopening the wounds Derek had carved into both of us. I helped her move out of the old house in Tacoma into a small, clean apartment closer to Seattle, a place with bright windows and safe hallways, and a manager who lived on site and knew every tenant by name. And although Linda insisted she did not want to be a burden, I reminded her gently that she was not a burden when she was cared for directly. She had been a burden only when her needs were filtered through people who used them as leverage. I worked with her doctor to set up a trust, specifically for her medical expenses, a legal structure that let me pay her bills without ever having to funnel a single cent through Derek, and the relief that washed across her face when she realized she no longer had to depend on him for anything almost broke me, because it made me understand how trapped she had been too, even if she had never found the courage to say it. She visited my penthouse once after moving, standing quiet and wide-eyed by the glass railing, and though she did not say it outright, I could feel her reckoning with the years she had believed Derek's version of me, instead of seeing the girl who stayed up coding until dawn, the girl who carried too much weight, the girl who had been right beside her the whole time. It took more than a decade for her to see fully what my life had been. The debt notices, the scraped-together meals, the long, silent nights alone, after being denied the fun she had promised. But sometimes, recognition comes slowly, like a thaw, not a flood, and I learned to accept it without demanding more than she could give. The final inevitable meeting with Derek happened in a hospital corridor. After one of Linda's appointments, he had shown up late, his hair uncombed, his shirt half-tucked, as if his life had become a series of hurried exits. And when our eyes met, there was none of the arrogance he once carried like armor, only a brittle exhaustion that made him seem smaller than the older brother I remembered. He said a quiet, almost reluctant, "Hey," and then launched into a tangled half-apology, half-justification, saying things like, "I was under a lot of pressure and you do not understand how hard things were for me, and I never meant for it to go that far." And he kept glancing at the floor as he spoke, as if afraid that looking at me directly would force him to confront something he was not yet ready to see. I listened, because listening cost me nothing now. But I did not bend toward him the way I used to. I did not fill the silences with reassurance or soften the edges of accountability. The way I once had, I just let his words settle into the hallway like dust that no one intended to pick up. When he asked if we could start over, I told him calmly that forgiveness and access were not the same thing, that I wished him well, but I would never again let him near my finances or my choices or my life. And he nodded stiffly, the nod of someone not used to boundaries who suddenly found himself shut outside a door that had once opened too easily. After that day, I understood something important, that family is not a title you automatically hand to people simply because they share your blood. Family is built of those who walk beside you without pulling you backward, and when I looked at the circle of people around me, I saw the faces that had truly carried me forward: Raina, with her unshakable belief and her quiet authority. My small Sentinel AI team who had worked through nights on takeout and ambition, the young women I mentored who messaged me their first job offers with pride and gratitude. And it struck me then that I had spent years begging for connection from the wrong people, when I had already found my true community among those who valued what I brought to the world rather than what they could take from me. The penthouse, which had once been a symbol of vindication, began to change meaning too. It no longer felt like a trophy held up to the ghosts of my childhood. Instead, it became a nest of calm. Above the noise, a space where I could sit on the terrace with a warm cup of tea and watch the lights of the ferries drift across the bay, while remembering the girl I had been, the one eating noodles in a drafty room, the one who thought if she succeeded enough, maybe her family would finally see her. And I realized with a gentle ache that I no longer needed to be seen by them at all, because I finally saw myself clearly. One evening, I stood on that terrace looking toward Tacoma, where the lights blurred into a faint constellation on the horizon, and I whispered to the wind a truth I had learned through years of breaking and rebuilding, that you cannot force people to recognize your worth, but you can decide to stop handing them the measuring stick. Life continued unfolding in quieter ways. After that, I spoke at a workshop for women in tech, discussing fraud detection and emotional boundaries in leadership. And during the Q&A, a woman in her 60s raised her hand with trembling fingers, asking, "How do I stop waiting for my son to apologize? I have spent years waiting, and it is killing me." And I felt the room hold its breath because every woman there had carried some version of that question in her chest. I told her softly that she did not need an apology to live a better life, that closure is not something we wait for. It is something we choose when we decide that our healing matters more than someone else's regret. And I watched her eyes fill with tears as she nodded, understanding something she already knew, but had never been given permission to believe. As the session ended and people gathered their notebooks, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Not loud, not triumphant, simply steady and whole. A reminder that justice is not always fire and fury. Sometimes it is simply choosing not to hand your power back to the people who once discarded it. And if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of a moment when someone underestimated you or used you or dismissed you, I invite you to share one line about that memory in the comments so you can set it down somewhere safe. And if you want more stories of justice, more stories of women choosing themselves, more stories of quiet triumphs that echo louder than shouted victories, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear that choosing themselves is not selfish, it is sacred.